Hey there, Sinners. It's Adam, and welcome to the first episode of the Cult of You in our new kind of membership space, or our own kind of private platform. So you'll see things are a little bit different, and I'll give you more insight on that in a future episode. But first, today we have our very first, on this new platform, interview with the devil. And my interviewee is someone you've met before, Toby Chappell. Toby and I have had conversations before on this show when we spoke about his work with the infernal geometry of the left-hand path. Now, Toby's last conversation that him and I had, he started alluding to his new book, which was The Language of Magic. This is an extraordinary piece of work. I couldn't wait to get Toby back on this because it's one of the few times that I find a sorcerer or a practitioner of the arts that's really lucid. I mean, he's technically accomplished, he's intellectually right there, he's somebody that's grown in many ways, let alone his position in the Temple of Set. He has brought together, I think, an incredible piece of work, and I think it's very important, especially if you're new or you're trying to break free from some of the superstitions that is in this specific arena. And the reason for that is he explores the subject of semiotics and how it relates to the practice of magic. And I've said this 1,000 times, that magic is the result of our conscious and unconscious communication. It expresses the concept that the universe is fundamentally energy, and the results that we're experiencing is the result of those communications, consciously and unconsciously, whether it's a change in habits, whether it is utilizing ritual to change a paradigm that's become seated in the sense of an identity, your appearance, your symbolism, your environment. All of these symbolisms are forms of communication. Now, he breaks this down in very exquisite detail, exploring a variety of subjects, and starting off with one of my favorite notions, and that is the concept of a mimetic entity, or the reference that he uses as meme machines. You're going to find a lot of value in this conversation today. I'm pretty confident of it. So sit back, relax, and remember to live deliciously. Toby, it's a fantastic opportunity to have you back. You and I have had some really good conversations, and you just keep coming up with better material.
It's really a great pleasure to be back. I really valued our last conversation. As I was mentioning to you before, it came at a perfect time. I was in the middle of writing the book we'll be talking about, and the opportunity to articulate some of what was going through my head around how to approach explaining the semiotic nature of magic was hugely helpful to me at the time. So thank you for that opportunity 2 years ago or close to it now. And to be back, it's wonderful to come back and be able to talk about the fruits of that work.
And it's amazing work. Like I said to you, like I even had to delay our interview just so I can make sure I get through absolutely everything.
Mhm.
Because not only did I enjoy it, but because I think it is so, I think it's a cornerstone. I think it's a valuable piece of work because it's not left-hand path, it's not right-hand path. It's the area that I love the most. It's the science of magic, almost, if I can use those terms. It is, why does this technology work? What is its purpose? Why is it still relevant? How do we apply it as a meta frame almost, instead of becoming religious over one single system? What is it?
Mhm.
What makes the systems work when it works? And that's really what I was able to take away from it. You were able to articulate ideas I've been toying around with and teaching with. So I'm really looking forward to breaking some of those down. And so thank you very much for taking the time to sit and chat with me. And so you and I can dive into this one today.
Sure, let's do it.
I want to talk about, like, I'm going to start off with the very basics, and I think we can build up our language as we go.
Mhm.
Um, there's this classic idea in the selfish gene about the idea of memes. And every time I laugh on the internet when I hear the kids talk about a meme, not knowing the origin of the word in the first place. And again, Dawkins talked about this notion of how the selfish gene almost replicates itself through philosophies and ideas in order to create it. And you go as far as to call us meme machines, so to speak. I want to understand what you mean by that idea and its context. Is the relationship to what was spoken about in the selfish gene? Is this purely a concept in semiotics? What is the frame here that I should be approaching it from?
Sure. So, The Meme Machine is the title of a book by Sue Blackmore. Sue has a very interesting history. She has a deep background in parapsychology and then later crossed over into psychology. So, she sort of tackled things from both sides of the coin there and attempts to unify them in some sense. And her book is very much indebted to Dawkins. Dawkins' original idea of the meme. The meme is anything that we can copy from someone else. It can be an idea, a word, a way of dressing, a way of thinking, a way of acting, really any quantifiable bit of behavior in the broad sense of behavior that we pick up, perhaps transform, and then pass on.
Hmm.
It's meant as kind of an analog to genes when during reproduction and the new organism is being gradually formed, you have lots of copying that's going on between the DNA is transcribed into RNA and then proteins are made and so on and so forth. But the catch is that process is not guaranteed to be perfect. Things can change in the process, either a
Hmm.
misfire or misplaced cosmic ray, what have you. And when you have change, sometimes those changes persist, sometimes they don't. Sometimes the changes matter, sometimes they don't. You can have a transcription error in the non-coding portion of your DNA, and it doesn't matter because it's not going to affect anything anyway.
Hmm.
Or you could have some disease that results from it because you're not making some protein that you need now, or not making the correct protein, et cetera. Similarly, I think with memes, sometimes we just pass them on. We know a good idea when we see it, but because we each come at everything we encounter in the world with our own experiences, and we evaluate things we encounter from the perspective of our experiences, there's always going to be those little shades of meaning and significance. And I kind of liken this in the book to natural selection. If if an organism is confronted with environmental conditions, there are certain changes that can happen randomly, not that can make it more suitable within that environment, make it more likely to survive long enough to procreate, to pass on its genes, to pass on that change. And over time, these accumulate into what's usually called fitness for that particular environment, those particular conditions. A meme has the same properties. If I rattle off a random string of sounds and you don't find it interesting, you're not going to copy it.
Hmm.
Or maybe if you find it interesting, but the next person doesn't, we could say that that meme did not find fitness within that environment. It wasn't strong enough or interesting enough to continue to be passed on. It didn't survive long enough in the consciousness of humans in order to continue to be replicated, reproduced.
Hmm.
And so the memes are intended to explain part of how ideas spread. We pick things up. Oh, that's interesting. That works. That gives me some additional understanding or ability I didn't have before. It gets passed on, and then if it is is interesting or useful enough, then it continues to be passed on. The reason Blackmore used the term meme machine, which is a wonderful book, and it's not a very big book, and it's very scientifically grounded, but it's written for a popular audience, so it's not an extremely difficult book to dive into. Is her idea? She does the study of consciousness. That's her particular area now. She looks at us as meme machines, as machines for picking up, modifying, and spreading memes as
Hmm.
part of how human behavior and ultimately human culture spreads. Within magic, this starts to become, this factors into several things. It factors into if you and I are discussing how to approach magic, and I have some innovative way I'm thinking about a particular problem or a particular type of magical form, and you find it interesting as well, you start to work with it. You go, wow, that's really something interesting. You maybe make your own changes to it, or maybe you take it the way you received it. and then you pass it on, and then the person you teach it to then has the same realization. Well, this is really interesting. This gives me some ability I did not have before, some understanding I did not have before, and passes it on.
Mm,
Um, these become ways of spreading different approaches to magic and different ways of conceptualizing and working with magic that give us new tools. Because if anyone who's studied the history of magic at all will easily see that magic is a very fluid thing. We have certainly have techniques of magic that we still work with, thousands, if not more, years later. But they're also innovative magic forms of
mm,
magic. For
mm.
example, some of the things that Austin Spare brought into magic, very idiosyncratic and interesting, but things that people found useful both in their simplicity and their way that they could work as almost a kind of open-handed magic, not requiring lots of setup and tools and props and all that sort of thing, but also primarily for their efficacy, how well they work, because
Mm.
that's really the ultimate test of magic. If it works, continue doing it. If it doesn't work, find something else. There's You don't have to become wedded to some particular approach to magic just because, well, that's the way it's always been done.
Mm.
That's the enemy of effective magic. That's not a an adjunct to effective magic. Now, certainly techniques and ideas about magic that persist over long periods of time have validity, and they gain validity, but they don't gain it just because they've been around for a long time. They gain it because people continue to find them to be useful things to pass on. So we always have to carefully distinguish between the two. Um, you know,
It's it's
age
it's
alone is not enough to make it worthwhile.
yeah.
Age and gets the job done. That's a winning combination for magic.
Mm. It's always been a fascinating idea for me, like how certain magical traditions continue to persist, despite it seemingly for many people that they don't work, where there's, that time of magical thinking is out of date. But I think as any deep, serious researcher, myself, yourself included, have found there are patterns, there are methods, there are
Mhm.
definite reasons, if you know where to look. If you're not kind of confusing. And I think that's the interesting frame about where we're starting off here, because the casual onlooker might be going, so what does this really have to do with my spells and my rituals and my techniques and,
Mhm.
this deity and that deity? When this is kind of the grounding, this is ground zero, this is the building block of foundation upon which these more complex arts of semantics are really rooted in. And I think to me, this is part of the essential keys that a lot of people miss, because otherwise, you use the term very politely, wedded to. They become wedded to these ideas. They carry their sacred cows. They become religious, in my perspective, over a system without actually marrying that system to their existing neurology, to their existing map or their model of reality. There's so many interesting ideas. So help me understand a little bit more. What is semiotics? How does it fit into the frame that we are building? And what are maybe some ideas to make the casual listener see the
Mhm.
relationship between that and their practice, or the building blocks of their practice?
Right. So one of the reasons that I began the book with a lengthy discussion of language and communication in the general sense, not necessarily the magical sense, is that it's something that is, at least to the extent that we do it, is unique to humans on
Mm,
this planet in any event. And the one of the key ideas that follows throughout the book is that even though I'm using very modern terminology from linguistics, these ideas have always been part of magic because humans, as we know them, have always been communicators.
mm,
So anything that is built into the software, if you will, of being a human is ripe for magic. It can be used in some way as part of magic. So magic is not something we do apart from normal communication. It's something we do built on top of normal communication. With semiotics specifically, people have a pretty general understanding of what language is. They understand that they speak a language, that other people speak different languages, and the extent to which you communicate with someone depends on the extent to which you share a language.
yes.
Um, Semiotics, in this sense, can be thought of as a more generalized framework of communication built on top of language. Or put another way, language is a subset of semiotics. Now, what semiotics is, just to give a definition of it for those who may not be familiar with it, is semiotics is the study of signs. A sign is anything that refers to something else.
Mm,
Semioticians will spend a lot of time talking about language because it's so accessible to us. But that's only sort of one part, that's only one type, words only one part type of sign. A sign can be an image, it can be an idea, it can be a concept, it can be a feeling, it can be a sound that tells you that a bell is being rung, for example. So it's anything that points in some way to the existence of something else, refers it, calls it to mind, calls it to awareness. And so that's the sense in which language is kind of a subset of semiotics. Language it uses either spoken or written forms to communicate words as linguistic signs that refer to things. If I talk about book, someone will surely have an image in their mind what a book means. They may actually have a book nearby that they will point to and go, oh, book, that goes,
Mm.
that collection of sounds goes with that. But the catch is there's nothing inherent in the three sounds in the word book. The b at the beginning, the k at the end, and the vowel in the middle. There's nothing about that particular collection of sounds that necessarily must refer to one of these things. That's a what we call a convention. We say that it's arbitrary, meaning it doesn't mean that I can just randomly decide that a book is now the animal running across the front yard. That is not talking about that type of arbitrariness. We're talking about that there's nothing inherently that ties those sounds and the object they refer to together in a way
Mm.
that it can only be that thing.
Yes.
Certainly, if you speak other languages, you the different language has different words for it.
Mm.
Perhaps if you speak another language related to English, then it may be a word that's similar in some way, or it could be extremely completely different, have no relation, no sounds in common at all. Um, and that arbitrariness idea is something people have a hard time wrapping their heads around sometimes because we use arbitrary in the kind of mundane sense to mean inconstant or to mean that you're just making stuff up or something like that. The way that, and I stress this throughout the book, the way that I'm using arbitrary here, the way it's used in linguistics, the way it's used in semiotics, is that looking at whether a connection between a sign and what it refers to is inherent in some way, or if it's just that's become the convention we use when you say
Mm.
these particular string of sounds, or do you have this particular image that's what we intend for it to mean.
Mm.
And the reason this becomes useful in magic is working with signs inherently. You're referring to other things. You're referring to the thing that you're trying to bring into being. You're evoking that as a possibility, and you're doing some steps symbolically and hopefully even practically following the magic in order to make that thing actually real.
Mm.
When it starts off, it's not real. It's just an idea that you have,
Yes.
but you attach signs to it. You refer to it in different ways to bring the full possibility of it into being so that you can now actually make it live in the world
Mm.
instead of, I mean, it's real in the sense that it's an idea within your mind, but it's not yet an actual thing because you've not yet put it out into the world. It's only
Yes.
real for you.
Yes.
Magic is trying to make things that are real for you real beyond or beyond just your conception of what might be.
Mm. I like that. I like that term. It gives me a couple of, there's so many ideas that have been popping in my head, like as you've been guiding us through this kind of understanding. And I'm reminded of the four classic Kabbalistic worlds, even in that initial kind of part there. We look at Atzilut, Bria, Yetzirah, Azai, and it is this kind of world of formation down to the archetypal world, down to the astral or emotional domain, down into the physical plane. And there's these statuses where the thought almost gets credibility as it goes down all the way into dimension. And like one of the ideas that you also spoke about in the book for things to kind of lead to the space of action was context. And context was required
Mhm.
to kind of bring these because the meanings of the word would be different in different contexts, different spaces.
Right.
And it adds to me even the idea of this being almost like a deeper neurological phenomena unique to the individual practitioner because my argument has always been if God had one name, why is it different in every tradition? If there was one specific mantra,
Mhm.
why wouldn't it be universal? Why does many traditions demonstrate practices that are successful of achieving these specific altered states of consciousness, even though the specific linguistics aren't exactly the same. The sound of the word, the specific placement of those letters are different. The languages are different, but the context and the meaning attributed to these sets of symbols neurologically seems to be what produces the emotion or the resulting consciousness as they produce. How does this foundational building blocks, this alphabet that we're kind of structuring up, and you highlight very specifically again, like the alphabet is a set of symbols, and it's one we use all the
Mhm.
time. And I think even in technosis, you also indicated alphabet is the first form of magic, the first system or technology of magic for restraining or manipulating consciousness in a certain field. What's your thoughts here?
Sure. So I think it's useful to look a little bit at how the understanding of magic has evolved. And I go into this in much more detail in the book, but I'll summarize the most relevant thought here. When it's sort of the dawn of anthropology in the 19th century among primarily British anthropologists like E.B. Tyler and James Fraser, their initial conception of magic when they were, I mean, one thing you have to discuss with magic with anthropology is that the way that it arose in the height of the colonial period, because there's a lot of trying to understand the different cultures that were now being exposed to the Western European colonial powers. And when we, and there was a lot of sense initially that what they considered to be strange beliefs didn't make sense. They wanted to understand why do these particular people believe these things,
Mm.
and this of course colored the initial kind of attempts to understand magic. Of well, they're this is a pre-scientific people we're looking at, so magic is maybe their attempt, their errant attempt to get at something like we would call science. It is very, very dismissive, of
Yes.
course. And not just about magic, but many aspects of culture that didn't correspond to Western European culture. Where you start to see a very significant turn it is, and the main figure in this is a Polish anthropologist named Branislaw Melanau. He was living in Papua New Guinea, studying the Trobriand Islanders that are off of Papua New Guinea, and he reached a certain insight that's very helpful for understanding the necessity of context in magic. What
Mm.
he began to realize, even though he did not believe that magic worked, he recognized that for the people that he was living among and that he was studying very, very thoroughly, that it did work for them within the context of their worldview. And he began to ask himself, why is it that they see magic as something that works, even if I don't see it the same way?
Mm.
And one of the things that he arrived at is that there was something about the language that they used, because he noticed that they would use words as part of ritual forms that might be the same words they would use in other contexts.
Mm.
And he started to wonder what makes, okay, if the words are the same, what makes them magical here, but not magical here?
Mm.
And the reason that he arrived at there is because they are given additional meaning within that context that they don't possess in the other context. The context is conditioning what the words mean, which is an idea from linguistics. He had studied linguistics, which even at this point we're talking about the early 20th century was still a relatively new science, but it was beginning to permeate the other humanities as well. People were starting to think a little bit cross-disciplinary about these ideas. And so what you have now for the first time, you have a Western anthropologist who is saying that magic is valid within this context and within this culture, and that it works, that it has conceptual value to them as well, not just serving to make them feel better about circumstances they can't control or something like that. And this was a major turning point. Other anthropologists later began to pick up on this and to expand, well, what is it about, go deeper, what is it about language and magic that makes them coexist more thoroughly? And one of the things that I emphasize quite a bit in the book, because we're talking at that point we were talking about a non-literate culture. This is talking about just with an oral tradition. So this is so we're not just talking about written forms of magic, but those are also, they also bring their own additional ideas and techniques to the table, which I'm sure we'll talk about in the context of the Greek magical papyri at some point. Um, so even in a purely oral society where you have language that works one way in one context, but a different way in a different context. We have that in non-magic practicing societies as well. We have things that you would call a register. Now, if you think about the way that you would speak, like in a professional, like in the office, for
Mm,
those of you cursed with office jobs, the way you would speak there versus the way you would speak casually to your friends, you speak differently. You might
mm,
phrase things differently in some ways. You might use some words in one context, but maybe not in the other context because they're not acceptable or expected, etc. So humans are very adept at shifting around in different contexts and adapting to what that context demands or what that context expects in
mm,
terms of the way we communicate. From that point of view, magic, especially some type of ritualized magic, is just it's an additional context in which we bring additional meaning to words that we use there, and we would not use the same words in the same way in that context as we would in a different context, but they take on meaning they have in this particular context they would not have in the other context as well. Because there's an entire subdiscipline of linguistics called pragmatics that is essentially about how we use language in different situations, in different contexts, and how that in turn affects the meaning of what we say. Because if I say some sentence, I in one context and take it out of that context, something's missing from what that may mean now.
yes.
And now, if I bring that context with the words, if I if I use the same words and the next time I encounter the same context, now I'm building up meaning that goes with that context. So they start to blend together in a sense. They become part of what I can combine to to work within that context.
Mm, mm. I find it so interesting. I love the idea of to give another kind of cross correlation on the subject. I always refer, I think today's modern spellcaster, quote unquote, is either the brilliant, is not really as much the witch with her cauldron as it's depicted. It's more the professional marketer, the experienced hypnotist, conversational hypnotist, or neolinguistic programmer. And these
Mm-hmm.
people very much understand, I think, the idea of the meta frame. Like, even if we're going out into social context, setting up a play meta frame inside of an interaction shifts even for people the frames that they assume. And we'll look at the exact same thing with people, right? The person goes to the gym in one context, and in another context they're completely approachable. In one context they're completely not approachable. Same human being, same people in the situation. It's just the psychological projection of the context that they find themselves in determines a completely different relationship to the symbols that weren't there
Right.
before. And I think even how we relate to each other, whether it's for mating, for finance, for friendship, for any of the fundamental needs we have as social animals, the context also determines the difference in terms of those same ideas. And again, this is the for me, it's the alchemist searching for nature and being blindfolded because he doesn't know where to look, where he has this other metaframe that takes him away of functionality
Mm-hmm.
that's happening in his nervous system that he thinks is abstract. He thinks it's the world. He thinks it's these places instead of recognizing it's a tool or instrument of consciousness. So there's another idea that you brought through even in the very beginning of this when you refer to or described memes as this notion that when two are kind of gathered and share that idea and it matches and it works. And I can't help but think about, firstly, the biblical reference where two or more are gathered in my name. So God is a meme. And
Mm-hmm.
the other one of the 100 monkey, 100 man syndrome. Are you familiar with the study where they've
Yeah.
isolated groups of monkeys? And they found that even though they were in completely separate encampments, when one monkey taught her child how to wash one of the potatoes were the only sustenance that was available readily, to wash this, the moment one monkey taught it to another monkey in another encampment, completely disconnected from them, the exact same thing started happening. So they assumed this was firstly isolated to animals, and then they tried the study with human beings. And they first took a photograph that was a Photoshop composition of 100 people's faces into one. Showed it to a group of people, tried to identify it. The average pass rate was 7%. And then completely blind study groups, they had it with another group. They then taught the second group how to identify all 100 faces. after they taught them how to identify the 100 faces, when they went to the third group, the pass rate moved up to 90, between 80 and 90 from the original seven, because of this. And again, this notion of the shared unconscious or the shared, and again, some of us refer to this even as some psychologists refer to the unconscious as a biological event, not purely an imagined event. And again, I'm just tying that in for the concept of should we say, the genetic element of this, the DNA element of this, that there's a deeper level in how this corresponds. So then in magic, there's so many cosmologies because you pointed it out in this tribe. It was unique. They had the magic worked in relationship to their mythology, to their cosmology and everything as a technology of remapping or altering or whatever the benefits of. We'll get to that at a later stage. You talk about hyperstition in context and superstition, and you talk about myths as codes and things like that as well further in the book. How do we go further here? How do we look further in terms of this subject of how we're making from these initial symbols into maps through which we start to experience our world, and how does magic relate to that system?
Sure. So a code is a term that's used in semiotics to talk about a collection of signs. There's there's a few sort of terms to use mostly interchangeably around that, and I use them relatively interchangeably in the book around codes, sign networks, semiotic webs. These are all collections of signs are somehow interrelated. For example, in the words that I'm saying now, the signs, the individual signs that are the words, are connected by the fact that I'm uttering them in a particular order, in a particular context, etc. But this can also be much more abstract. For example, think about if you go to the coffee shop, you are engaging in a particular code that's there. There are standards of behavior that are expected. You wouldn't just stand up in the middle of the coffee shop and start shouting, "The I invoke the headless one," right? You know, you
Unless
get
you're a
hauled off to
unless you're a
the
TikToker.
well.
Yes.
No, again, context matters,
Yes,
right?
context. Exactly.
Context changes the code. Context changes what is acceptable and what is expected.
Yes.
So behaviors are codes. Anything that's part of culture is a code. It's not just one little thing. It's a collection of things that go together.
Mm.
The catch is we treat codes as if they're sometimes as if they're kind of ordained of like this is the only way that this can be. You think about, for example, different behaviors around the way that people eat, about the types of food that are considered that's not food or that's food, whether what sorts of utensils what sorts of behaviors you're expected to have around other people. There's nothing forcing you to do that in a certain way. There's nothing inherently biological that says we can only eat these specific things or that we have to use a fork. But codes are one of those things when everyone that is broadly conforming to the code that applies to the situation you're in, we tend not to notice them.
Mm.
But someone, in a fine restaurant reaches down and scoops up a handful of rice with their hand, everyone immediately notices that the code has been broached.
Yes.
It makes the code becomes present in a way that it wasn't before. It was like
Mm.
implicit in our behaviors, but now it's present. The way we bring this into magic, think about. I'm going to use a more extreme example than my typical magical practices, just because it's easier to illustrate the point. If you think about someone that is very well versed as a practitioner in high ceremonial magic, where
Mm.
you have the particular robe that must have these symbols on it. You have these particular sets of things on the altar. Maybe you need to do it at certain times and certain places. Maybe you need to do it with or without certain people, etc. All these complex things are part of the code that applies to that type of magic.
Mm.
Now, the code is going to be both shared, something that someone else that is of the same school of magic as you would do more or less the same, but there will also be things that you bring to it that may be a little bit different. Maybe there's some choices of what color robe to have, and you prefer to wear the blue one, and someone else prefers to wear the red one, something like that. So there's always this flexibility in codes. And when we lose track of the fact that codes are flexible, there's always something that can be added to them and changed. We make them into living things that we can then work with as magicians. Because from this perspective of there's a particular code I'm working within. So let's say, for example, that the goal of my magic is to get a new job. There are certain things that are part of that code in the mundane sense. Well, I need to fill out applications. I need to update my resume. I need to apply to the jobs and gain interviews, go through the ritual of an interview.
Yes, literally.
There's ritualized aspects of it, of course. But if, as a magician, I'm also approaching this like, well, what can I do to enhance beyond just those mundane things? What can I do to enhance the odds of me getting this job? Well,
Mm,
perhaps I decide that I need to create a sigil that is predisposing me to be more aware of opportunities that conform to the type of job that I want.
mm,
So I'm going to bring in, let's say that I'll use that through Austin Sparrow's technique of the word reduction method, where I make a statement of intent, I then reduce it down to the individual letters, and then I gradually make this more and more abstract symbol that still somehow contains the essence of the statement that I spoke. I'll work within that code of how to create sigils, but I'm going to do it in my own way. I may decide, that I want this letter to be hinted at in this way in the sigil, and someone else may decide it in a different way. There are
mm.
always variations about how you apply the code that are related to your experiences, your understanding of the code, your your flexibility, how well you can play with the code. But what
Yes.
I'm doing is I'm now taking the code that govern the creation of the sigil, all the symbols and signs that went into that, with the symbols and signs that go with the other code around how to gain a new job. And I'm kind of overloading one code with the other. I'm adding my code around the magical part of it to this
Mm,
overall code of the things that everyone has to do if they want to gain certain kinds of jobs. So I'm expanding the code. I'm not taking the code as a given, as a static thing that can only be worked with one way. I'm adding additional signs to it that now can become part of the code.
yes.
They become part of the sign network that is being built here.
Hmm.
And there's a principle in semiotics when you're analyzing or creating a code that represents some complex of behaviors or thoughts or concepts, called what is most salient. That means what is most dominant in the code. So if I say that I'm going to take this very mundane code of getting a new job, things that even non-magicians know, these are the components you're expected to do as part of this. Then I add these additional components. I bring in the magic part of it as well, because the fact that I applied magic that is going to stand out within that code. It's not something that's normally part of it. It's something I'm adding to it that's going to take on this presence within that code.
Mm,
I'm making the magical intent that I'm adding to it a salient or the prominent part of that code for me. So when I and doing all the other parts of the code, filling out the applications and interviews and so forth, I also have that additional thing I've brought to it that
mm,
now for me has become the prominent aspect of the code that's kind of guiding the rest. So the entire thing kind of takes on this magical intent as well.
mm.
This is part of. I mentioned James Fraser earlier. He's famous for writing The Golden Bough, very well-known book
Yes.
in folklore studies and magical studies. The full version is like 18 volumes or something insane. Usually you see it as single book distillations of
Yes.
it, mercifully so. A lot of Fraser's ideas around anthropology have not stood the test of time. However, a couple of aspects of it that are very relevant to magic have. These are what he called the laws of contagion and the law of sympathy. The law
Mm,
of sympathy says that if I am working with something that resembles the thing that I'm attempting to affect, then there's a magical connection between the two. Sort of the cliche case almost to talk about it with, is the idea of the voodoo doll, right?
yeah.
It's a representation somehow of the person or the thing I want to affect. I do things to the doll. It has some corresponding effect in the person. The law of contagion, on the other hand, says that once something has been in contact with something else, it retains something of its essence. Um, the my go-to example for that is the classic M.R. James story, the casting the runes, where there's a curse that's being passed along, not intentionally. There's a curse that's written on
Mm,
paper that's given to the person that is the intended target of the curse. The paper becomes mislaid, becomes in the possession of someone else. But the curse, because the paper had been in contact with the curse, it had been encoded with the curse, it now passes on to the next person. Remains in contact with the curse
Yeah.
once the paper has become part of the curse. Bringing this back into this code, the idea that I can take this very mundane code around getting a particular kind of job, and I can add these additional things into the code. Now that code has been touched by my code. It takes
Mm.
on some of the properties. I've kind of spread magic throughout the code at that point. So and my intent around it has now become part of that code. Now, does that by itself guarantee that I get the job? No, of course not. Magic is never guaranteed to work. Magic is tilting the balance towards certain things to make them
Mm.
more likely to happen.
Mm.
If there was a guarantee that I could have, then I wouldn't need magic at that point. I would just do the thing that makes it happen and not bother with magic.
Yes.
Same thing like if I decide I want to turn the light off, if I the easiest thing is not to sit here and to create some elaborate ritual to try to cause the light to turn off. The easiest thing is to walk over there and turn off the switch, right? So at that point, that's the thing you do because that's the path that has the greatest likelihood of success.
Mm.
But with magic, I'm working with things that don't have just a simple on-off switch that I can interact with. I'm doing other things. I'm trying to like tilt the balance towards certain things manifesting within the world, whether that's because I'm influencing someone else to make them more likely to conform the situation to my desires, or if it's also that I'm conditioning myself to be more aware of what actions may call out to me and go, oh, that is part of what I need to do in order to make this happen, to make
Mm.
myself more aware of it. Um,
There's an interesting kind of exploration again in the fields of influence, and the should we say bumper sticker version of it is whoever's the reality is the strongest always wins. And part of this notion is again you can walk into a bar, you can walk into a business, and people's bodies, their body would actively become submissive to somebody that they perceive as more dominant than they are. And someone's
mhm,
individually inherent dominance is predominantly influenced, I find, by their, should we would say confidence, but it's about their credibility of getting the outcome that they are after, or their perceived social status. And even again, the social status is another symbol, right, in terms of the
right.
context of the entire space. So my belief is very much here is that with utilizations of this, because there is a fundamental ritual syntax, right? That
Mhm,
happens inside. There's these symbols, there's the semiotic web, and the ritual is the sequence or the syntax in which I go through those places and what I believe is going to get me to the success. And if with the inherent structure of my new meaning making tool system, my magical technology, if you will, I am potentially more able than the other person that perceives these factors as outside of their agency,
mhm,
and the result of that is a state of uncertainty, a state of self-doubt, which is a lessening of dominant reality inside of their relationship to the other person's state. And again, the observer effect or the even principles of hypnosis, we influence without even attempting to influence, the butterfly effect, right? So if somebody, in
mhm,
my theory, has structured their magical practice in such a way as the add-on to infuse their results with greater meaning, almost as Attila the Hun or some great seeker that goes into battle convinced of their immortality, convinced of their success, their dominance of reality, or their sense of certainty being far greater than the other person's sense of certainty, is what kind of technically leads a hypnotic advantage. And we see that in hypnotism when young hypnotists are being trained in hypnosis. And the core idea there is as long as you have the assumption that the other person will fail to go into the trance, that's what will be subcommunicated to the other person. And
mhm,
so there's this structural setup for magic that I think is inherent, and it's actually far more common. It's not that,
mhm.
we've
Yeah,
now unlocked some secret universal deity that's now empowering us. It's this restructuring of the semiotic code, this
mhm,
hacking of ourselves almost in a way is how I'm starting to perceive it the way you're describing it, that
right.
kind of opens that up. So where do we go from there?
Yeah. Well, part of what you're doing is you're trying to build the stronger connections in the code. If you and I are in some kind of a conflict, right? You have all the things that are in favor of your code. You
Yes.
have your appearance, your demeanor, the way you're speaking, the gestures, et cetera, that you may make. And I have the same tools at my disposal. But if I'm making a stronger connection between those, that's part of how you
Mm,
make one code dominate another, right?
yes.
And so a lot of magic is inherently about connection. You're connecting ideas that were not connected before, so that that law of contagion, that transfer happens. That now the idea moves along the connection to influence what it is that you're attempting to bring about through
I
magic.
think like is one of the things as
Yeah.
well that I just kind of like locked onto again, like as you were starting to share that, is this why the new student practicing a system of magic doesn't work necessarily, or it does. It does because
Mhm.
they have no map. They have no model of symbols to suddenly represent these other aspects of reality. And now suddenly they're inheriting one and it syncs. If it syncs, then it's accepted and then it works. But if they have a contradictory one inside of their
Mhm.
nervous system, adding that new system on will actually fail them. And then they would go and say, the system of magic was not for me, or the system of magic doesn't work. And it's not at all that the system of magic doesn't work. It's just that they were taking the medicine and not actually understanding the underlying cause or the underlying problem was something completely different because of how that
Mhm.
network is set up. It's an interesting build up process. But so
Right.
then and this was a talk that I recently had on triggers because I gave a little comment about my perspective of certain American influencers that own certain social media platforms. And needless to say, I respected their capacity. I didn't respect their ethics inside of my
Mhm.
statement. But I was amused at the mixed kind of reactions I was getting from people. Some were completely subordinate. I highlighted that I wasn't specifying the individual. I was simply specifying this principle of behavior that I think is inherent with power, that you should be demonstrating to have congruent power. And the trigger responses of people just by throwing out the symbols of the word highlighted me to have the talk of triggers, how a trigger response is an automated sigil that's already been installed in our place. And I feel like if somebody's going to try and install a sigil in a ritual, it doesn't mean anything if you've got, again, like the symbiotic code with deeper installed symbols that are automating your emotional reaction. And as such, the energy you're releasing in correspondence to this idea. How's your semiotic view of not only correspondence systems and how they correlate to this and their place of practice, but we talked about the idea of hyperstition and mythology. How does that fit in to structuring this and using magic as a way to restructure it almost?
Right. So hyperstition it's a really interesting concept, and it's becoming a bit more widely known now, I think, even if people may not realize the origin of it. The origin of it is simple. In the mid to late 1990s, Warwick University in England, in the philosophy department, specifically at Warwick University, there was a group called the CCRU, the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit. And this was a kind of para-academic collection of philosophers, both the faculty as well as some of their students, that were taking a broad look at what at the time was perceived to be a very rapidly changing landscape in the way that humans communicated with the broad adoption of the internet. And they a lot of what they practiced and wrote would not be seen as philosophy by most people, but it also always had a very philosophical bent to it. These are people that were like lived and breathed very modern, cutting edge philosophy like pretty much all day. One of the ideas that popped out of that was something called hyperstition, and we're pretty familiar with what a superstition is, and um, and the idea that hyper is something that's even beyond super in some way, as a prefix to the CCRU, or the CCRU as they uh, would often style it. A hyperstition was an idea that brought itself into being, that had some inevitability about it. An easy to talk about example with that is the idea of space travel. Once we came to the realization that there were things beyond just the Earth that we live on, and that were bodies, the moon being one of the most prominent ones and most nearby to us. There that there may that if it's outside of the earth, then is there some way we could actually get to that and beyond? And so, without anyone sitting down and saying, you know what, this is going to be humanity's mission for the next 1,000 years or whatever, nevertheless, things started happening that eventually led to that as a possibility and actuality. Um, if you think about like the different economic, scientific, political, et cetera, changes that had to happen to marshal the resources, to marshal the will to do this,
Mm.
to eventually they all kind of coalesce in this thing, and now this is all these things come together to make this possible.
Yes.
And the thing about hyperstitions is that in retrospect they seem inevitable, but not so much while they're unfolding. So I work with a bit with this idea of hyperstition within the book of the way that you take certain things that have an inherent possibility and you take steps both directly for that purpose, but also as a side effect of other things that you're working toward in order to make them happen. Uh, um, Hyperstitions are kind of like the big picture things, saying that it's inevitable that I'll have lunch later. That's not going to be a hyperstition, even if I do in fact have lunch later. But things like that, we want to have this new political system or something or whatever. If it catches hold in enough minds that enough things start to move in the direction toward this is an ideal that we want to shoot for in some way, then so many other things start to go along with that
Mm.
to make it more likely to eventually come about.
Would you say it's pre or post word virus? I love the choice of the term word virus, and I think many have kind of postulated this notion how language almost directs mind in terms of possibilities, oftentimes how we utilize
Mhm.
it. Would you say a hyperstition is pre the utilization of words in that conversation that initiates a shared set of possibilities, or is it post? It requires first the assumption of that. Where do you think it falls?
Interesting question. I think it has aspects of both. I mean, some of it depends on whether you go along with the idea from the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan that the unconscious is structured like a language, that there's something inherently linguistic about even the structure of our psyche. And
Yes.
I'm not talking about whether or not you can talk about something that you're feeling or something that you're perceiving, but that the way our thoughts interact with each other, interact with each other is linguistic in some way or has some of the same properties as languages do. Because if you think
Mm,
about languages work because languages have a certain amount of structure, but they also have a great deal of flexibility.
mm.
You can have infinite production of sentences. You can always utter a new sentence that's never been uttered before in the history of mankind.
Yes.
Um, Even if it's just adding you know one more phrase at the end of the same sentence, right?
Mm,
Um,
mm.
yeah, to be or not to be in
Today.
Athens, Georgia today,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
May have been said, maybe it hasn't been said, right? So you can always like add something to it to make a new sentence. In terms of the hyperstitions, I mean, certainly, I think that they're aspirational before they're articulated. Before you may communicate the idea to someone else beside yourself, and then once they pick up on that meme, they maybe then decide that their thing that this is also a desirable meme, and that these other things must happen to go along with it.
Which seems to me is the evolution of art in many ways, as almost like a
Mhm.
first transmission point before
Right.
the final point of words are almost like the smallest compressive unit. But again, you did point out that sounds, art, all these are symbols in terms of
Mhm.
expressions and overlapping. I think just at the artistic level, we are more magically capable of manipulating and bringing in something that is maybe at these deeper levels of the unconscious into a place where it can then eventually form. I think historically we can see there's always been a shift in sexual dynamics in a society, followed by a shift in the arts, and then followed by a shift in the political structure of the society as well. So it kind of
Mhm.
leads me to the possibility, or just at least the creative contemplation of that a hyperstition could be, as the old mythological language would state, the self-begotten God, so to speak, that sprung forth of itself, born of itself, or sprung forth from Zeus's head, in terms of without the copulation of another component in matter or in time or in space, in order to bring about this next level of consciousness. Like some people would say Beethoven's music ushered in a different frequency of possibility that then structures us in another way. Does that link, or am I kind of flying off the deep end here?
No, I think there's a lot of value to that. Everything wasn't possible until it was, right?
Mm.
Um,
Yes.
when enough people want to bring it about, they take steps to make it so. The art example is very interesting and very it makes it an easy one to kind of discuss it around as well. If
Mm.
you look at the history of music, just thinking just music in the West, you see various developments. I mean, some of it, people will be mired in certain styles or genre conventions of how they approach music, but then someone does something outside of that and does it in a way that's compelling enough, because it's not just a thing to make like random sounds that are outside of the dominant kind of tonal language of the day. They have to be compelling enough that other people decide this is interesting and worth pursuing,
Mm.
and is opening the way to new possibilities that weren't there before. But that also works in a sort of hyperstitional way. If you think about Schoenberg and atonal music, the idea that well, we have 12 notes, why do we only have to use this certain subset of the notes? Well, he didn't invent new notes. He's using
Yeah.
the same 12 notes that are already there. He's stepping outside of the existing code that you have to approach them in only the certain subset of the 12 possible ones within a given
Mm.
context, to say that now I'm going to use them in a new way to free us from these previous strictures and open up new ones. But the catch is, once you open up a new way of doing something like that, it eventually it will only become a new prison.
Yes. Has to be evolved out of.
Right. You eventually that it will coalesce into its own. This is the style that we do this type of music in. It's
Yes.
almost where you get like the cliches of like, well, it so embodies this way of doing it that it's almost an ironic approach to it, instead of bringing anything new to the table. But
Yes.
then you only have to find new
Sorry.
new ways of communicating through music. And I think that's the case with so many things that are the product of minds, is that there's that releasing the possibilities that were always there that we have to
Mm.
do. And that's part of what magic is about as well. You're releasing possibilities in the world that were there, that you're deciding to focus on a particular one, to say, I want to nudge the universe toward allowing that one to be a bit more manifest.
Mm. Mm. It actually gives me a profound little insight just in terms of like building on these blocks and these ideas that you share through the book. And earlier we spoke about that the meaning of a thing in relation to the symbols is very much defined by the context. And now we're talking about hyperstition and this realm of possibility that opens up. And I like this kind of iterative approach where it almost has to crystallize an idea into being or into an accepted, shall we say, shared meme in order to rebel against it, as Lucifer does in many ways, into the next form and into the next shape. But the next shape wouldn't have been possible without the previous one. And at the same time, the shifting of this requires a fundamental shift of context. Once we take that same art or that same technology and we suddenly apply it to a completely different field in areas. And I mean, just to take, and again, the arts in such a simple way, I think there's a show, and I forget what the name is now in theater, but it's an old classic Broadway musical where you have these gangsters that play, and this was also from an old time. Yeah, I'm trying to remember what the name is of the musical.
Okay, the West Side Story, maybe.
West Side Story, yeah, and it
Yeah,
was one of the longest running like
right.
theater pieces, right? And this was at a time where music was structured and classic dance was structured in a conventional way, and the lifestyle of the time was all the gangs and everything that was going on, and then the cross population of the context shift of symbols that were actually common to people and patterns that were almost like a I don't know if the pattern here would classify as a hyperstition or the evolution of the hyperstition that was initially crystallized in these forms, now combining to produce another form. And that novelty seems to open up a whole new symbiotic web, a whole new neurology that
Mhm.
evolves out of it that we are intoxicated by as human beings. Like it literally it takes our money, it takes our attention because we're now investing in that next level of reality. So I love how a lot of like the ideas we're speaking about here, again, like we opened up with that conversation that what you've done here in this book is not just depict left hand path magic or right hand path magic or anything like that, but the technology, really a technology that explains magic in many ways,
Mhm.
and why or how these systems work or how we can fit them together. And I think here is a list of examples already for the common listener, or even for the average or astute listener, on how these are applied in literal actual events that have happened in history, in not necessarily with an occult flavor, but literally a business flavor, how they're affected in relationships. You have some really great examples in the book where you really go into kind of areas. And I enjoyed your walk through Liber and how that was. You've no doubt, like from our earlier conversation, you had a whole list of ones that you wanted to put in from the Greek papyri
Mhm.
that you never got to. Can you open up a little bit? Look at these contexts and these ideas. I think we've painted quite a couple of them. Maybe there's some more that we can dive in as we go, but some context in
Yeah.
relationship to these on how we can interpret it from this position.
Sure. Liber is actually a good one to frame the discussion around, I think, partially because it has, a predecessor in the Greek magical papyri. So the
Mm,
Greek magical papyri are is the name for a loose collection of documents from Greece and late antiquity. So we're talking around, I believe, from the second through the sixth century of the Common Era, give or take. Um, where you have a very word based and sign based type of magic that's an evidence there. Um, they are I forget the exact number of manuscripts. There's a large number of manuscripts, and they were not originally a collection. They basically kind of grouped together broadly as this kind of style and this kind of approach to magic. And a couple of the features that they share in general are what can be variously called barbarous names or uh, magical names,
mm.
motus, the Vocus magic,
Focus.
or even fusion words,
Efficient. Yeah.
which is a reference to a specific set of words of unknown origin that were inscribed on a temple in ancient Greece. But what these are names that are they don't correspond to any known god or any known name or
Mm,
entity. They're kind of magical gibberish in a sense,
mm,
but they have a semantic purpose, even if they
yes.
don't have semantic content. And
Mm,
the purpose they serve is they would typically be featured in part of the evocations that are done in various of the rituals found in the Greek magical papyri, where the magician is calling forth some aspect of themselves, calling it forth externally. They're giving it a name, and
mm,
they're not they're not saying go out into the world and do this for me. They're not creating servitors or something like that. They're invoking the powers that they perceive that belong to that thing. Give
yes.
me the power of this name during in the context of this ritual that I'm doing, so that
Mm,
I have this ability, this power, this ability to affect the world and to affect
mm,
myself. Um, so that's one feature that sometimes they're completely made up. Sometimes they are clearly influenced by uh, words that were not Greek, whether from Hebrew or other, what they would consider more exotic languages that were not Greek, that are kind of made Greek-like in the way that they're pronounced, like using the sounds of Greek. But the basic idea there is that there's something that's other, something that stands apart from the normal everyday experience. So there's a
mm,
speech that only would be used in a magical context that wouldn't have
yes.
any meaning outside of that context. Another feature that pops up regularly within the Greek and magical papyri is using writing as part of the ritual act. You may write something on a piece of paper and then put it around your head as a
Mm,
headband. There's one, and I believe this is one of the ones I talk about in the book. There's one where you create a special kind of magical ink It gives the formula and says that these are the incantations that you do, and this is the time that you make it. These are the ingredients, and then it now has these powers. This is part of a spell from memory, and then you write certain things on paper, and then you dissolve them, and then you basically imbibe what's in there, and now you take it in as part of yourself. You're not that law of contagion again. You're touched by this. You've internalized this external thing as part of it. Another feature that pops up quite a bit in the Greek magical papyri is using what's sometimes referred to as the seven sacred vowels. Greek has seven vowel sounds, five short, what we would call short vowels, and two long ones. And the reason I think I argue this in the book, the reason I think that the vowels have the particular one of the reasons they have this particular power is about the way we articulate vowels. You think about a consonant like these sounds like that. Cat has two consonants, one vowel. Has a k sound, a t sound, and it has the a in the middle. Consonants, by their nature, by the way we create them in our vocal tract, are discontinuous. We're stopping the flow of air in some way in order to make the sound. Sometimes we're stopping it completely, like with a t sound. Sometimes we're kind of constricting, like with the sound. But in either case, we're not letting the air flow freely through our vocal tract. With vowels, we are where different vowels are created by the way we shape really by the way we're moving our tongue within our mouths. But we're not really restricting the air to the same extent we do with a consonant. So they have something continuous about them. And it's also consonants can be either voiced or unvoiced, meaning whether or not you vibrate your larynx when you say them or not. Yeah. Vowels are always voiced. You can't make a vowel sound without vibrating your larynx. Like if you just put your hand right here and go, you'll hear you'll hear the ah, but you'll feel the vibration.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of why vowels took this sort of mystical, magical quality, because they're continuous. They are opening to the infinity of possibility. They well understood that the universe, as they understood it, even in a geocentric view of the world, that's still too big to be grasped by the human mind. Right? Still, it's effectively infinite. And of course, if you take into account what we now know about the structure of the universe in a physical sense, it's technically not infinite, but it might as well be, because it's far too vast for us to grasp in any finite concrete way. And that universe of possibilities, that effectively unlimited set of possibilities, is part of what we're working with as magicians. We're taking some of that and we're constraining it, we're carving it out of the infinity of possibility in order to decide to make this have a real persistence within ourselves and perhaps even within the world. And using vowels in this way seems to be a way to connect with that. And of course, it's also connected with things about if you do breath work, because again, you have to breathe sound out in order to make a vowel. So all of the benefits and all of the magical effects and the physiological effects of breath work are also part of it as well. So they become one more sign, if you will, as part of this constellation of how we work with the breath, and how we work with articulating something that connects with this infinity of possibility we work with as magicians. And so these are just some of the features that are commonly found in the Greek magical papyri. Some will use them to greater or lesser extent. You don't find every technique in every text. Some of them are very short. Some of them are several pages of material. But tying this with your question on Liber Samak, so Liber Samak by Crowley, that was his ritual magical form for gaining knowledge and conversation with the Holy Guardian Angel. This was based on a spell in the Greek magical papyri. It's sometimes called the invocation of the Headless One, or the spell of the Headless One, or the closest thing that seems to be a title. These spells don't have formal titles, but they have kind of taken on titles as people have studied the language in them. The stele of Jao the hieroglyphicist, which is a mouthful. So right at the Headless One is usually easier to refer to with, because it opens with the lines. I invoke the Headless One, be created night and day, and so on and so forth. So, and Crowley was aware of this, of course, and he did not portray that as something that he wrote independently. But what he did do was he said, okay, he has this understanding of the original ritual, what he thought of as its purpose, and the mechanism by which it achieves that purpose. And he takes, there are a lot of these barbarous names, these meaningless names that are used as part of it, that the magician takes on as part of this invocation. And what he does is he breaks those apart. He says, okay, maybe they didn't have a meaning in the original Greek, but if we break them into these elements, we can say that this syllable has this association, this correspondence within his system. And so he's using that as a key in order to break apart certain things in his system of correspondences in order to invest this with even deeper meaning. Because if you take something that's meaning, something that has no meaning in and of itself, but you give it meaning, you say, I'm going to work with this as if this is the thing that's intended to mean.
Yeah.
You're taking your knowledge and experience, and you are using that as a tool to gain some access to a deeper part of that knowledge and experience. And so it becomes one of the most interesting and most beautiful rituals in all of Crowley's body of work, in my opinion, because he's not just taking new words, new ways of looking at things. He's taking a very old thing, 1,500 years old, at least by the time that he was working with us, and he is giving it a new form, a new meaning within the context of his system of magic. Everything that was part of it there is still there. It still has the original context. He's now expanding that context in order to have additional meaning, additional kind of capability, and additional precision. That was a big part of what he was attempting to do as well, is to say, one of the things that's common in the Greek magical papyri is there are some sort of step-by-step things on some of them, but they're rarely written out of the way we might write out a ritual these days in our way of looking at magic. They were pieces that you had to fold into your own way of working with those pieces. They didn't do all the work for you. You had to do some of the work. And what he's doing with it is he's doing some of the work in his own way, and he's bringing these additional things to it. And he's wrapping some form around it that was not there to begin with. But he's still not saying that you have to do this letter for letter. There's still the intent that you're still going to bring your own associations to these things. You're still going to map these onto your own system of correspondences. Because that's sometimes missed with Crowley's work. He writes about 777 that this is my set of correspondences. You have to find your own. Yes. They may line up with mine, and that's fine. But unless they are aligning with your experience and your understanding, then they're not going to have as much meaning for you as the things that you would create. Same thing with Austin Osman Spare and his Alphabet of Desire. Even Spare himself forgot the meaning of some of the symbols of his Alphabet of Desire by the end of his life. Some of it was because he spent most of the second half of his life as a blackout drunk, which didn't help. But again, the idea that it didn't matter if he remembered the innate meaning to them. It mattered that the symbol evoked something within himself. He would have certainly said that his magical self knew what it meant, and that's the part that counted. Same thing with Crowley's system. So again, it's not enough to just take any magical work, any magical set of correspondences, or any magical ritual, and to just treat it as a strict cookbook to follow, wrote by the numbers. You always have to bring yourself to it in some way to make it living. Because if magic doesn't live through you, then you're going to find it to be much less effective.
There's so much here, and I think it's golden important nuggets for anyone listening, because these are the breakthrough ideas. Like if the astute listeners really like holding on to these things, whenever I work with students in my personal training, my first stages are always, let's work through your dreams, let's work through your existing symbol systems, let's see what the map is there, and now let's see how we link it to other maps, right? And I'm listening to how you're describing
your code, your sign network.
Yes, exactly. Without it, you're missing like half of the equation. You're almost like one-sided, trying to masculine conscious force the thing in, and your creative feminine unconscious is just sitting back and going like, I'm not sure I trust you here. There's no actual relationship between the parts. And I think maybe at a deeper, more actualized level, that is to a degree, maybe at a smaller version, what the manifestation of the Holy Guardian Angel is to an extent, is this part crystallized into a deeper relationship with the magician. Because we always find this classic phrase, and I've heard it from authors like N.D. Blackwood, even referring to the original Abramelin text, referencing the French versus the German versus some of the beliefs in the vampire cults. This notion that, or at least in their version, this notion that even when the Black Adept has attained the knowledge of the daemon or the dark gift. And the same thing is that then suddenly they're free from the spells and rituals. They no longer have to use this map because they're free to create anyone they want to for any need, and they have access to that system. But that being said, I loved listening to that description that you just gave because in my mind, what I could see, firstly, you pointed out the notion of the breath in association with the words, right? The vowels being more flowing versus the consonants being a little bit more kind of locked in or cut in. And we know, again, you pointed out the studies of breath work in association to this. We know the historical association to breath, air, and spirit in the Chinese systems also being correspondent. We know the relationship that has to physiology and your actual experience of time. And the thought that kind of came to mind here is we wrap our sense of self, the character quite literally of self, inside of a coat of time and space and its existing correspondence or semantic map or code. And in doing what you're describing, isn't it a case of where what is actually, firstly, you need to take part of your code. You need to take part of your map and plug in those different parts to this grander system or this alternative system as a methodology to potentially take you from your massive association to self as a known. I know myself in time. I know myself in space. I know myself because of this history or my version of reality. I know reality because of these symbols and these signs and these ideas. And you're almost repatterning them as steps outside of the known in order to escape your limited condition. Hence the experience of altered state of consciousness that then ensues as a result, because the sense of self is in theory being resolved or dissolved inside of that transmutation, getting you out of the personality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think part of what it comes down to is that there is no just one code that we work within. We have multiple layers of codes we're always faced with. And we have some that are because we are humans. For example, we can only hear and see within certain ranges.
Yes.
There's visible light that's outside of what we're able to perceive. There are sounds that are above and below our range of hearing. And that those limitations on the input we can take in, those and other limitations, they shape how we relate to the world in certain ways. Okay. We also have the codes that are built on top of us by whatever culture or society we may happen to live in. Things that you do and don't do that constrain our actions in some sense, but also help us to interpret the actions of others.
Yes.
But we also have the codes, our particular worldviews. Like magical thinking as a worldview, or the the different talents and pursuits that you engage in that have certain codes that go along with them as well. And so there's always this tension that we're trying to find some coherence of self within these sometimes competing codes.
Yes.
Right, because maybe that it's not culturally okay to to blast music at 3 a.m, right, where you live. But maybe you live in Hollywood on the Sunset Strip, and that's normal, right? So again, it's context specific. So sometimes they make these different codes. They constrain us in some way, and they give us a framework to interpret the actions of others. But we're still trying to find ourselves in all this as well. And some people decide that they want to identify with a specific code and go, I want to dress in this way, I want to act in this way, talk in this way, behave in this way, so that I'm perceived as being part of this group. We all have parts where we do that to greater or lesser extent. Even the most rebellious among us, probably still wears pants when they go outside, right? Yeah. It's like, no, you're a rebel. Well, walk outside, buck naked, and see how far that gets you.
Yeah.
Right. But finding those places where we can find ourselves within the codes, where we can express ourselves, we can overload the codes that are available to us with things that are uniquely us. That's part of the ongoing challenge. And part of what magic is doing is helping us is to probe those boundaries so that we can. Yeah, I very strongly believe in a way of conceptualizing magic that is written about quite a bit by Don Webb, where he talks about the secret of magic is to transform the magician. Part of what there's multiple levels that you can read that on. One of the ways you can read that is that in order to become capable of greater things, you must become someone who is capable of those things. You know, folding magic back on itself, back on yourself, in order to make certain things more possible to you. Maybe you decide that you have this great aspiration, you want to attack with magic, but it's so far above where you're at now that it's not feasible that you can just get there through magic. So maybe you undertake additional things to make you more capable of that. Say like you wanted to be a concert pianist, just to pick a random example. Well, you may have that desire and you may have the drive to do that, but it's not something you can just immediately obtain. And it's not something you can certainly say the right spell and then wake up tomorrow and tickle the ivories like uh who I don't even know who a famous pianist would be these days, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, I should have picked guitar because that's what I actually play, but we'll roll in with the piano one just in case. But again, you may have you may employ magic as part of your journey to get there by clearing distractions from your time, and now you have the time to practice. You may use magic as part of how you stretch your boundaries of what you think is possible for yourself. You always want to push a little bit farther than where you're at now with magic. If your magic is just geared at maintaining your current state, that may be what you need for now. But if that's where it remains, then eventually you'll find that you don't need magic anymore because you've just made a stasis you can live within. If you want to keep magic as something that's available to you, you have to be pushing it towards new things in order to push yourself toward being capable of those new things. Again, the secret of magic is to transform the magician. You want to be able to affect something magically in a certain way. You need to become the person that has that ability. Because your ability to make magic work within the world is going to be directly related to what you are capable of affecting. And you have to change that as well, not just what's around you. You have to change yourself in order to be able to reach into that in order to bring it into being.
So when we have this, so we talked about there's this idea of self, these multiple different kind of encodings, these layers, so to speak, and which also kind of explains why our confidence is broken at some points and great in other ones, right? Because different contexts can kind of fire off different of these networks. You spoke about the idea, maybe I'm interpreting it incorrectly, but there's the concept of infinite semiosis, signs pointing to signs.
Right.
If we have a healthy setup correspondence system, if we're able to somehow organize the mess of the maps there, how would that create almost like an uplifting or an upwards pointing sense of self as a result of this in this kind of like infinite loop, or are we kind of stuck with that program if we're not able to, should we say, re-encode the mythologies that underline it?
Well, I'd say that the way that we ourself is expressed as a thing in the world, is that total of your experiences, whether both magical experiences and mundane experiences. And once you have attained a thing, whether you've attained some understanding of something, you have achieved some level of status within the world, you've achieved some level of physical comfort, those now become part of the what you stand on in order to reach further, right? So you're constantly your horizon building in the way that Nietzsche would put it. And in fact, that was one of the core aspects of being a human that he identified as that man is the horizon builder. We we see we see further, we seek to see further and further, but some things we're not able to see until we've reached a certain level to see them first. I love the story of the explorer Zebulon Pike and his discovery of what's now called Pike's Peak in Colorado, I believe. This was in the period when the Western U.S. was being let's be frank, colonized, and but also explored to see what was there, so they knew what and who was there, and this peak far away, and you could tell from the distance it must be a massive peak, hugely tall. And he set the goal of himself and his party. I want to go climb that. I want to see what's there. I want to see what it's like from the top of that peak. So they eventually they approach the peak, they approach the mountain, they begin climbing it. They reach the summit, and then he realizes they had just climbed the mountain in front of the one he'd been looking at, the one that was. They realized that it's even further and even higher. But that's the thing. You might say, okay, that was a waste. And
Yeah.
ironically, he never did climb the peak that's named after him. But he was not able to see it until he had ascended that earlier summit. He
Mm.
needed that vantage point to understand this is this is what I'm truly shooting for. Because what you see in the distance is going to be missing certain details about what it actually is that you can't see. You can't know until you're closer to it. And so we can't think of that as a failure, at least as a magician. We can't think of that as a failure. We have to think of that as I've gained an experience and now it gives me a fuller understanding of what I'm really attempting to shoot for. And then we can decide, am I satisfied with where I'm at now? Which is still, you still climbed a mountain. You're still further
Yeah.
up than you were before. You still have accomplished a thing, even if it was not the thing you set out to do. Or you decide I need to push forward to move ahead to find an even bigger peak.
Mm.
Um, and that's a crucial aspect of being a magician, is that recognizing the peaks and valleys that you need to cross in order to be able to attain the things you see in the distance, the things you maybe not know, you don't know fully what it is yet, but you
Yes.
know that that's where you need to be. Um, but you need those experiences of making it part of the way first, so that you can see more clearly what it is, what's still left in order to attain that thing. But also, now you can see it in a way you couldn't see it before, that tells you something else about it.
Mm.
And maybe you decide now that that's not what I need after all. But you're still transformed by the seeking.
Mm.
This is where we could go off quite a bit into symbolism around, like, the idea of the Grail, of course. But
Yes.
that's part of what the Grail is about. Is that the point of the Grail is not to hold it in your hand. The point of the Grail is to be transformed by the seeking.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. The rediscovering of meaning and the rediscovering of
Right. The
feeling as well.
rediscovery. Well, and the integration of meaning into your own understanding,
Mm. Mm.
which you can't do sometimes until you've had the experience of it.
Yes, yes. In fact, it would be meaningless. It would be powerless because you'd have nothing more than a conceptual grasp. None of the network would not have changed. I think it's Tony Robbins
Mhm.
that talks about the breakthrough experience requires experience. And
Mhm.
it's about taking the body in the full matrix into an area that it doesn't do before. Because I think if we take that metaphor from the beginning of the four Kabbalistic worlds, that initial concept that goes through those stages of articulation, it even does so in terms of our biology. And our body kind of
Mhm.
stays there. So I refer to this as elemental psychology in my sense, in that, the air is the
Right.
intellect, the water is the emotion, that we're feeling, the fire is the action that we're taking. And through the combination of these things together, which is really communication at another level, right? Because magic to me is the measurement of if the reality is the result of the communication we're experiencing or projecting both consciously and unconsciously, not just exclusively our own, but everyone communicating to this matrix of experience, so to speak. Then the study of magic is in many ways is discovering what are the different outcomes I desire and how to change the communication at these varying
Mhm.
levels. And then essentially to recognize that the intellect is a representative component, the water, the air, it's ways we've linguistically kind of articulated, and earth being the body, the final recognition position of where our patterns or our habits or now our unconscious communication is really occurring between what we're unconsciously communicating to reality, hence the magical result called our life happening at that kind
Mhm.
of experience. So that context of shift and experience moving into I want to come to my last question, because we've been taking up some good time. It's a great conversation. I never can get off of it when I'm with you, because now you've spun up three more threads that I would love to explore.
Well,
And that's not even
infinite
closing off.
symbiosis, right?
Yeah.
Infinite
Yeah.
symbiosis in the
Yes.
flesh, I guess.
Yes, exactly. I'm loving it. I'm enjoying it. So before I ask that question, Thank you, Toby. It's really refreshing to have a conversation with a fellow magician or practitioner of our arts that is lucid and is able to recognize ask the critical question, why does it work? When does it work? And
Mm.
not be religious about something, having something that just says, because I believe it, without actually being willing to kind of explore those ideas. And I think it's that merit of faith established as a result of belief, like or faith established as a result of research and understanding and critical thinking that kind of helps one see through the veils and stops us from staying at the primitive ages of magic and
Mhm.
recognizes that it's still a living technology for today. And it's one that we, quite frankly, have lots of experimentation to do in. And I think a lot of people kind of get enchanted because disenchanted because they keep practicing, and Joseph Campbell pointed this out, right? The problem, we have a crisis of myth in that our society is trying to make maps of meaning from myths that no longer have relevancy to our world. And I think a lot of people practice magic in the same way. I've even coined the term that says that the Magus was the lost era and the current era is the technomancer, right? And it's purely because I see magic as a technology. So my
Mhm.
question, what if, and it's speculative in the sense of where it's one of those heated ones because there's so many positions around it when we talk about the nature of spirit and whether it's real or not real, and there's arguments on both sides of that fence, and talking about this idea of the horizon and going to that other mountaintop and the known moving from the known. um you talk about Lovecraft's work, and we know, and actually I've learned from you about how he wasn't really a good advocate of practice of magic, yet
No.
yet he seems to have access to this portion of the unconscious to give these hyperstition-like archetypal forms that seem to have taken on different contexts in our lives and our world as it's influenced other societies and groups. Looking at that, and then looking almost at the myriad of correspondence. Again, like so many of them just are absolute rubbish. I think any serious practitioner that sat and put the time down to look at the Goetia and correspondence to the Shem and realize just how astrologically this makes no actual sense. Like most of those things don't fit. And so many of about historically how they've changed and altered and been borrowed from tradition to evolve. Are these potentially almost hyperstition-like developments in our collective? And can these utilizations of spirits and archetypes, whether drawn from history or drawn from mythology or even from folklore in these cells, act as tools outside or an establishment of a psychic vocabulary, if you will, in order to move to that unseen mountain that you may not yet be able to as a practitioner? And if so, how? How does one differentiate and how does one apply?
Right. I look at those. Let's take the Lovecraft example because that's a good one to work with. Not the least which because I've already written a book about that. um,
Good one.
but one of the reasons that Lovecraft is a good way to look at that is the way we the way that Lovecraft's work has permeated modern culture would be completely mystifying to him. He lived his entire life, obscure. Most of his adult life was in fairly extreme poverty, and he also had this weird aversion. There were things available to him where he could have lived, a more comfortable life, but he didn't take them. Why exactly is open for debate, and there's plenty of debate around that in Lovecraft scholarship. But one of the things that he did do, which I think partially explains the way that he has permeated, today's kind of world in the way that it has, is the extent to which he was willing to use his dreams in an almost philosophical sense. There's a very philosophical underpinning to Lovecraft's work. He's saying quite a bit about cosmology and about the way the world functions. And so he's approaching it from a very kind of materialistic point of view, but he's also approaching it from a very kind of cynical point of view, and sort of the idea that the universe could not care less about us, and if it had its way, would just kill us all.
Mm.
Um, but he the way that he corresponded so widely there's something like I believe it's 6 or 7 volumes of his letters, and these are just the ones that still exist.
Wow.
Um, was a voluminous correspondence, like unbelievable. Like he must have spent the majority of every single day writing letters. Something that's hard for us to imagine these days, of course. But even at his time, that was an unusual thing as well. But what it meant is that he put his ideas, not just the ideas from the stories that that had pretty poor distribution in his lifetime, but his his ideas beyond just his stories, dreams that didn't turn into stories, his musing on other writers, his different aspects of his philosophy. He put that into so many other minds, including some that went on to great fame. Robert Bloch is one of the primary ones I'm thinking of there that became a hugely successful and well-known horror and science fiction writer. Wrote several episodes of the original Star Trek series, the Psycho,
Ah,
etc. It was like probably one of the most enduringly famous correspondents from Lovecraft. It was someone that Lovecraft had mentored a lot because Bloch was a young man at the time. And even among, what seemed to be his kind of two closest friends in the literary world, Robert E. Howard and Clark Ashton Smith. Howard especially has been pretty enduring with Conan the Barbarian and
yes.
his stories. Smith, unfortunately, is like criminally underknown today. In terms of like sheer writing, I think Smith may have actually been the best one of the three, just the sheer craft of writing. But I'm going off on a tangent. But what I'm leading up to here is that because these seeds of ideas of what could be were planted in so many different heads that people then incorporated into their own stories. There was a lot of intentional cross pollination.
Yes.
So things like the Necronomicon. So if you just read about the Necronomicon and Lovecraft's work and didn't see any mention elsewhere, you go to the card catalog and see, okay, it's not there. This guy made it up. Okay, fine. But then you see it pop up in a story by this other writer, and then this other writer, and then this other writer. Then you start thinking, hey, wait a minute. Then maybe this is real, and maybe there's a reason it's being kept from us because it is as dangerous as they say, right? Maybe it is a real thing they're writing about that we should know about. Then 40 years after Lovecraft's death, you have an actual Necronomicon that's written and published. Avon Books, actually, it's right behind me over here. I can't quite reach it. It's right there. It exists now. Right. It has a real existence in the fact that I can drop it on the table and it makes a sound, which Zoom probably edited out of this thing. But you get the point. It is real in that sense. Whether this is a real representation of the Necronomicon that Lovecraft wrote about, there's a secret continuation of the real text that he learned about in hushed terms and etc. No, probably not.
Mm.
It's nice to dream that way, of course, but probably not. So there's just like a minor bit of a hyperstition there. It became enough of a thing that eventually someone wrote one and said that this is it. And of course, now I have one, two, three. I have three other Necronomicons on the same shelf, right?
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
Even taking it a bit further with my first book, Infernal Geometry and the Left Hand Path, I was writing specifically about a set of techniques and philosophies around magic that were derived from a ritual called the Ceremony of the Nine Angles, written by Michael Aquino. It's found in Anton LaVey's The Satanic Rituals, which takes ideas from Lovecraft, the magical skeptic, and says, what if we as magicians make something real out of these ideas? We make them real.
Yeah.
And you see that there are other instances of the same thing in some of the works of Kenneth Grant, etc. Again, there are things that once the idea was planted and took hold, and enough minds decided that is an idea that we want to see become real in some way, eventually other things happen that lead to it becoming real. Hyperstitions don't have to just be the big scale things like going to the moon. They can be the what if this book existed, right? Or they could even be what if we can take these ideas and make something new out of them that the author hinted at but maybe did not want to see come to fruition. We who are not bounded by the same limitations,
yes.
The same materialist worldview, the same view of the fiction that it's just for entertainment and has no other value. That we who bring new things to that code that was attached to it, we can now make it into something else because we can take those ideas and we can change them. You can use them to create new things. They're still connected with those original ideas, but they're not identical to them.
Mm.
And they wouldn't have come about if we had not brought something new to them in order to make the missing ingredients, if you will, that were needed to make them real. And if magic is anything, it's bringing those missing ingredients to make something real that was only imagined and now can have some real effect within the world.
I love it. A powerful notion of how, at the end of the day, we are magicians creating reality, and the
Mm-hmm.
technology is inherent in everything we do. It's not, you don't become a ceremonial magician, you become aware of yourself as a ceremonial magician, I suppose. And we can make the average mundane person tends to make the fears real, and make their disease real.
Mm-hmm.
They make their broken social image or the fact that they don't fit in. They make all these things real instead of going as far as exploring these ideas to make them real for a structured purpose of their life. And I'm reminded of a study in psychology as well around when people judge these systems, as many have judged magic in many ways as
Mm-hmm.
well. And one of the common ideas of when somebody looks down upon something is predominantly because they know not enough of the subject, and there's the fear of the ignorance, which unconsciously lowers social status. And as a result, as part of the defense mechanism, it just looks at something as if it's beneath it in terms of discussion in order to not appear ignorant or in a lower status in association to the subject. So
Mm-hmm.
we're the pioneering technology. I've had a great conversation. I hate that it has to end. So
Yeah,
I hope,
likewise.
yeah. So I mean, what's next? Before as we close, I'll tell you, are you bringing us another one? Are we going to do a workshop on these things at some point? You know, is this the lost book for a little bit? Or are you working on something else?
Um, I have a couple of projects that are kind of in the early stages. May become books, may become series of blog posts, etc. I mean, you'll have some links and etc. that you can share along with the interview, so people can find me and keep up with my work.
Yes.
Um, I'm I'm working deeply with these ideas. I mean, my work with this doesn't end with the book. This is really just the beginning. This is me kind of articulating what I understand about this at this point in time. It'll be the jumping off point for additional exploration because I'm this approach to magic has been very much part of my understanding of it for some time now, and I even write about the history of that in the book. I'm always very much about the history of ideas. I want to know not just what is the state of this thing now, but where did this come from? Where are the influences? What are the connections? Because there are always things you can dig deeper into to understand more what something is really about.
Yes.
You can always dig deeper into the roots to really understand what something is.
Yeah. Correct the misunderstanding quite often that kind of
Right.
breaks a lot of paradigms or keeps people blocked because they're unwilling to go back into the root and really understand what those spaces are. Yeah, I think
Yes.
especially it's true for a lot of left hand path traditions as a whole. I've seen so much unique superstitions, not hyperstitions, manifest as a result of that missing bit of origin data that I think could have been placed.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, you can never fill in all the gaps, but you should always fill in as much as you can because it's only going to help your understanding. It's only going to help you build more and more connections within the knowledge that you're trying to wrap your head around. Because magic, the full breadth and possibility of magic is always going to be too broad for any one person to understand. But the best you can do is to grow your understanding into that possibility as much as you can in order to become a more, you know, effective magician.
Before as we finish up, Toby, any last thoughts for the audience as a starting point? Your book is available obviously through Inner Traditions, everywhere
Yes.
else. Any closing thoughts for them to get through existing semiotic trap in opening their minds up to some of these ideas?
I think that the thing that I'll say, and this is a bit about the structure of the book, is I spend several chapters toward the end taking in-depth look at different techniques and schools of magic. I look
Mm.
at the Greek magical papyri, library. I look at the runes. I look at modern schools of magic, such as, and I use that term in a loose sense, not formal organizations necessarily. So things like the techniques of Austin Osman Spare, the chaos magic movement. But I also look at the Temple of Set, of
Topi
which
as
I'm a longtime
well.
member. Yeah, Topi, Temple of Psychic Youth, the Golden Dawn. I spent a lot of time looking at Enochian and sigil magic as things that
Yes, that
connect
was
between these
interesting.
groups. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
like connecting thread between them.
especially how it evolved as well, showing it's not exactly the authentic structures that we're seeing from the Golden Dawn influence on it.
Right. Right,
Yes.
right. But to get there, to have the proper framework to talk about those things, I talk at length about linguistics and semiotics, and it is not just as like a dry textbook, but I'm always looking at for the different ideas I bring up in those around their history and the different terms and things like that that help with understand magic as a process of communication. I'm There are examples throughout where I'll talk about this technique. For example, I talk about the idea of performative utterances, which are
Mm.
speech that has an effect within a certain context and has that effect just by nature of being spoken. And I talk about them in terms of Anton LaVey's the Dielektrische Vorspiele.
Yes.
Um, right. So I bring I'm always bringing examples into it to try to keep the reader engaged, but also try to open the reader's eyes to their new ways to look at
Mm.
this. And even if I'm using newer terms, I'm looking at ideas that have always been latent within magic
Yes.
and kind of connecting them back both modern and historical. So there's quite a bit of bounce around in timelines. I talk about probably 3,000 years of magical practice. If you take from the earliest thing I speak of is an ancient Egyptian technology called execration texts, and then bring that all the way forward into, literally current approaches to magic. So there's a lot here for readers to find that may match with some of what they know, maybe introduce them to new ways of doing magic and new ways of thinking about magic, because that's the ultimate goal here, is to show there's a another way we can think about magic, and here are some building blocks you can use to apply to whatever your own school theories, techniques of magic are. It's not just written for people on the left hand path or the right hand path. It's written for anyone who has an interest in the mechanics of magic
Mm.
and an interest in taking whatever magic they do and learning how to look at it in a way that will help them understand it better.
Yes. Toby, thank you so much for everyone listening. There's links down below, along with a couple of series of quotes from the book and some other key summaries of things that I found interesting, as well as links to everywhere you can buy it today and references to Toby's work. It's been a great pleasure and an honor chatting with you again, my good friend. And I look forward to the next piece of work we're going to do, next conversation we're going to have together.
Yeah, you as well. It's always a pleasure talking. You always bring out quite a lot in the way I'm thinking about these things.
Love the subject and I love how your mind works. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.